Okay, R.C. Sproul, Part 3.
According to Romans 8:29, who are those who will be glorified? Find out next on Renewing Your Mind with Dr. R.C. Sproul. Welcome to this Wednesday edition of Renewing Your Mind with teacher and theologian Dr. R.C. Sproul. Perhaps you believe that God looks down the corridor of time and sees all that will choose him. And based on that choice, God then predestines people. This extremely quick summary is commonly known as the foreknowledge view. If that's the view you hold to, then you stand with the majority. The favored scripture passage to defend this position is Romans 8:29, where we find what is known in theology as the golden chain. Foreknowledge, predestination, calling, justification, and glorification are the highlighted links to that chain. But a chain is only as strong as its weakest link. Of course, there are no weak links in a chain God makes. But as Dr. Sproul will explain today, there's more than one weak link in the so-called foreknowledge understanding of the golden chain that doesn't hold. Continuing with our study of predestination, here's Dr. Sproul with the golden chain.
As we continue now with our study of the difficult and vexing question of predestination, we recall that in our last session I gave a brief description of the two most important competing views of the doctrine of predestination. There is the view that we called the prescient view of predestination, and I'll review that for you quickly. Prescience, or pre-science, is simply a synonym for the word foreknowledge, and it is called the prescient view of predestination because it looks something like this. The idea is that God looks down the tunnel of time, the corridor of history, and he knows in advance who will respond positively to the offer of the gospel of Christ. And on the basis of that foreknowledge, he chooses those whom he knows will say yes to the gospel unto everlasting life. And so election or predestination is based fundamentally upon God's foreknowledge. The other view, the Augustinian view, is that God predestines people to believe. That is, if it were not through the grace of election, the idea being no one would willingly come to Christ, and only those who have been predestined are the ones who, in fact, make a positive response to the gospel. But those are the two most important competing views, and I want to spend some time today on this idea of prescience and foreknowledge, because perhaps the single most important biblical text that is used to support the doctrine of prescience, or the idea that election is based on God's foreknowledge, is found in Paul's letter to the Romans in the 8th chapter, beginning at one of the most famous verses of that book, Romans 8:28. We read the text as follows: "And we know that all things work together for good to those who love God, to those who are the called," or the elect, "according to his purpose." And then verse 29 is where we find the classical location for this concept of prescience. "For whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, that he might be the firstborn among many brethren." And then we have in verse 30 this famous text, "Moreover, whom he predestined, these he also called. Whom he called, these he also justified. And whom he justified, these he also glorified." Now that verse that I just read is often called in popular language the golden chain, because there is a chain of redemptive actions or events that is summarized here. Those whom he predestined, he also called. Those whom he called, he also justified. Whom he justified, these he also glorified. What we have here is also called a shorthand version of, again, what is technically called in theology the Ordo Salutis. O-R-D-O-S-A-L-U-T-I-S. I wonder how many of you out there have ever heard that phrase, Ordo Salutis. I'm going to ask my studio audience to raise their hands if they have heard that little Latin phrase, Ordo Salutis. Let me see your hands here in chambers. If you have, raise them up where I can stand and count them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. You know, that's only about 1/3 of our people. So I have to assume that most of you out there in radio land also haven't heard this phrase, Ordo Salutis, but you know RC can't get through a lecture without some Latin, so we have to have a little Latin. The Ordo Salutis, that's not hard to translate. Ordo means order, and Salutis is the Latin for salvation. We've all heard the phrase plan of salvation, and the order of salvation has to do with the old chicken and the egg question, what comes, at least logically, first in order. And what we have here is an order that starts in verse 29 with foreknowledge, because those whom God foreknew did he also predestinate, and those whom he predestinated, he called. You see the order here. And those whom he called, he justifies. And those whom he justifies, he glorifies. So there is an order here. And the first step in the order is foreknowledge. Now that is deemed extremely significant by those who maintain a prescient view of predestination, who argue that God's election is based upon his foreknowledge of future events and of what we will in fact do in the future. Now notice, first of all, that the text doesn't say explicitly that those whom he foreknew on the basis of his foreknowledge he predestinated. That's not in the text. The text doesn't say it. All it says is that those who he foreknew, he also predestinated. This view assumes that the predestination is based in some way upon the foreknowledge. Does everybody understand that? Okay? But it is an inference. It's a reasonable inference. It's not a necessary inference, but it is a possible inference from the very order of the way these things appear.
Okay, I'm going to stop it there, and we'll pick up on the next video to continue on with part 4.